So you've expanded your horizons. I'm used to saying Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group, but you've stepped off to where now? You've expanded.
Yeah, what we decided to do was launch a project, the Pillar of Law Institute, that we're going to be focusing on free speech full-time nationwide. So this unfortunately has required a move from me for the to the Beltway here to Washington, D.C., but it's going to give us a nationwide outreach, kind of a base camp here to continue the free speech work that we started in Wyoming, and we're already expanding before we spun off from the Wyoming Liberty Group.
Okay, now be careful, Steve, because people in Washington, D.C. start drinking the water, which comes from the Potomac there, and something strange starts to happen. So I'm worried about you living in that area. I don't want you to head down that path. I had an interesting conversation earlier this week on Tuesday. I remember I referred him to you at one point through your articles. Have you spoken with Jason Pye from Wyoming, from Freedom Works?
I haven't actually spoken with Jason. I did see his segment, though. It seems like it's great that national attention is being given to Wyoming efforts on civil forfeiture.
Right. And is that what we're here to talk about today, civil forfeiture?
Yeah, and that's what's keeping me from getting that Potomac fever, Glenn. Hopefully, the opportunity to come back to Wyoming 3 times in the legislative interim as the legislature once again considers asset forfeiture reform after the bill that passed overwhelmingly in the session was vetoed by Governor Meade.
Okay, now I always have to do this just for those people who've never heard it before, so let's catch up real quick. Civil asset forfeiture is basically what?
It's basically where the government can seize your property and then keep it forever in a civil proceeding by alleging that it's related to the drug trade. You don't have to be convicted of a crime. You don't even have to be charged with a crime. So if you're pulled over on the highway and they find cash or firearms, or just think that your car is related to the drug trade, that you either bought it with drug proceeds or that you're on your way to go buy drugs, it's a very open-ended law, and it's a very dangerous law, and this is why it's being reformed in states nationwide. Mexico, the governor signed an era of legislature passed, and just today, the Montana House passed a bill. Now it's been heading to Governor Scott Bullock's desk that will also require a criminal conviction before the government can keep the property that's allegedly related.
Okay, so now here in the state of Wyoming, for those who haven't heard this story as well, is legislation was sponsored. You were a part of that, and it looked good to me. I mean, it didn't say that they couldn't seize something during the course of a raid. It was just basically the government had the burden of proof. But the governor vetoed it here in the state of Wyoming. So how, since our legislative session is now closed out for the year, how does this get a second chance?
Well, fortunately, after the veto, the leadership in the legislature decided that the Judiciary Committee should reconsider the whole thing once again. And there is, even though our legislative session time, 20 days, meeting of the Judiciary Committee last week in Riverton. They're going to meet again, I think, in August in Gillette, and then one more meeting in Cody before the next legislative session. And during that time is when the committees can look at topics and can formulate bill drafts that eventually become committee bills if they're approved by the committee, and those will get introduced. And traditionally, what are called committee bills have a much better chance at passing because they come up first in a legislative session. They're to the committee when they consider a bill by the rest of the legislature.
Okay, so whatever they do here, we're still going to have to wait until next year's legislative session in order for them to introduce this?
Correct.
All right. Is there anything different that you think would satisfy the governor in what they're planning to do or could get past the governor? Because this time around, it didn't seem to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't seem to me that the veto couldn't have been overridden. They could have. It looked like they had the votes, but there were some backdoor smoke-filled room maneuvers that were pulled to make sure that it would never get to a vote to override the veto. Am I correct? Is that pretty much what happened?
Well, eventually it dragged on, and the longer it dragged on after the governor's veto, before they reconsidered the bill, it was about a week between the veto and when they finally had the vote. During that time, I mean, every day you could feel, I think, pressure from the law enforcement lobby, a letter from Attorney General Michael illustrating his concerns. A lot of those concerns, what I chalk up to a lot of red herring. Basically, the The bill was meant to cure the fact that the government can't take your property away without convicting you of a crime, and law enforcement continues to make the strenuous objection that if they pass the bill, then the government couldn't take away your property without convicting you of a crime. So we're still at a bit of a a bit of a standstill, and I think that's kind of what's led to at least a more conciliatory stance by the governor's office. At least at this first meeting, it looks like there's Senate File 14. That was the bill last year. The committee is still going to hold on to that, but a new bill is being drafted that's going to retain the civil forfeiture process, but up a lot of the due process. And I mean, right now there's just nothing. And that's the big question. Is I think the bill last year was enemy of great, but big nothing is the enemy of good. And right now the law has no due process protections whatsoever. It's really up to the Attorney General's office what they want to do with seized property. And as I pointed out in my testimony, we have open cases right now. We have seizures of cash that happened in November of 2013, that it was almost a year before the property owner, before the government even filed a complaint against the property. So the Attorney General's position right now is that they can seize your property, sit on it for an entire year before you even get a day in court. So that alone is a constitutional issue. And I can tell you right now, the interesting part is one of these cases, a case involving $470,000 in cash that was, as I mentioned, seized in November of 13. The attorney in that case is very angry at the current system we have, which is not in writing. It was just really made up whole cloth by the AG's office. And his objective is to take that all the way to the Wyoming Supreme Court. Now, the case is going so slowly that we might have a legislative session before then, but I've read over their briefs. I think the arguments are sound that even though the Supreme Court has kind of approved the civil forfeiture wrongly, in my opinion, but as a general rule, they've approved it, there still has to be due process in there somewhere. And unless there's, say, a criminal case going on, which in this case of $470,000, there wasn't even a misdemeanor charge. It was just, hey, you're carrying a lot of cash. We think it's drug related. So, hey, we're going to take it. And, next year, 9 months from now, we might get around to filing a case. And after that, we're going to drag it on as long as we can in hopes that you'll settle and give us all this money. And so we don't have to prove anything. So it's still very problematic in Wyoming. I've held on to my opinion that we're not abusing it as badly as some other states, but that doesn't mean we pass the test. That just means that Wyoming has failed less than a lot of other states, but that's still failure.
In the interview, you probably heard Jason Pye from Freedom Works is going to put out a civil asset forfeiture map and grade each and every state. And what was astonishing to me was Wyoming got a grade of F. And I thought there's got to be some states out there that, I mean, and I mentioned, I know it's a city, but I said, what about Philadelphia, which I like to call Philadelphia? How is it possible that they got a better grade than we got? And he went through all of the reasons why. And in his mind, it's not so much a matter of how many times somebody has been caught in the civil asset forfeiture, trap. It's that wasn't his reasoning behind the grade. But let me ask you, I was curious as you were explaining all of this. Okay, so let's say I have, $50,000 seized from me. And it's going to be about a year before they even file the paperwork, which means even longer than that before I finally get to court. Is there anything I can do, a complaint I can file, or maybe something I can file against the state or whoever sees my property to get in front of a judge and say, no, we're going to deal with this right now. I want my money back?
Case is going on right now, Glenn, is that the AG's position is that you can't. The AG's position is you can sit there and wait for them to get around filing a case, and they've got up to a year under the law to do that. That's their position. There is a case of about almost $50,000 seizure where a lawyer did work really hard to get into court, and the Attorney General's office argued, no, that's what's called a replevin action, and that's prohibited under the law, and you can't do that. So the AG will argue that against you for doing that, but then when you do wait around for them to file their case, then they're going to make other crazy legal arguments like, even though the police pulled you over and seized $470,000 from your car, you don't have standing to come in and prove that that property, or excuse me, and argue that that property is not drug related. And by standing, I mean you have no place in court. You have no interest in the property. So it's worse in Wyoming. It's not, the civil forfeiture system often works out to being that you're guilty until proven innocent. Well, the AG's office has actually argued in court, and this was last month, this was in March, they actually filed something in court saying you're not even entitled to your day in court until you're proven innocent. So you figure that out, Glenn. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the whole idea that if they took $400,000 from me that I worked hard for and earned, I have no interest in the money. A hell of a lot of interest in that money. They moved you all the way to Washington, D.C. to work specifically on what?
I'm working specifically on free speech issues, particularly as they relate to campaign finance. Now, that's about as exciting as it sounds, you might think, but what we're seeing is kind of a nationwide issue. And I mean, I don't know how many people, anyone out there who reads the National Review magazine, but online, an article was published this week detailing what's going on in Wisconsin. And there's basically an inquisition going on where some prosecutors, some very partisan prosecutors, went around the state in 5 different counties and ended up waking some people up early one morning, a lot of different people. We don't really know how many or who specifically, but raiding their homes, treating them like drug dealers, and telling them they weren't allowed to even call their lawyers or speak about what was going on, tell anyone their house was raided, even though their neighbors got to witness it. And what were they looking for? They weren't looking for drugs. They weren't looking for evidence of real crime. They were looking for evidence of what's called campaign coordination, which is a completely made-up crime that basically accuses people of speaking with Scott Walker's campaign about certain issues and then going out and opining on issues and basically acting as a shadow campaign for Scott Walker. It's part of an effort to silence people from engaging in the political process, and this is a direct result of having these very unconstitutional campaign finance laws that allow for these kind of inquisitions. It's not just happening in Wisconsin. There's a case in Washington State right now hopefully going to the United States Supreme Court that was kind of emerged the same way. Texas is full of problems as far as the overall criminalization of politics. And we're really trying to get into that fight and really combat a lot of these unconstitutional laws head on. We had a pretty great track record in Wyoming with some litigation there, but Wyoming really isn't the problem. Wyoming has a very good, stable, predictable, easy to understand campaign finance system. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And we don't have an enforcement system like you'll see in other states. In Wyoming, if you accidentally break the law, which is usually what happens, the Secretary of State doesn't fine you. They call you and say, hey, can you fix this? And they actually help you do it. We have a very helpful elections division. But in other states at the federal level, it's what I call lawfare. And a lot of people are using that term now, where we basically, instead of engaging in politics, people who disagree with you will use the law to distract from your campaigning, from your issues. They'll use the law to make sure the money you have is going to pay lawyers instead of paying for communications. And all of this adds up to they're using the law to silence people, to shut people down. And that's exactly what the First Amendment was enacted to prohibit.
Okay, since you're a lawyer, I would suspect your first instinct is looking at this from a legal point of view, and here's how you fight this legally. Since I'm a personality type, my first instinct is, well, everybody needs to have cameras around them. It's very easy to get body cameras and cameras in your house and so on. It's very easy to have things put up on social media once a raid like this happens. In other words, I like to fight things in the court of public opinion and then go for the lawyers second, and then go ahead and talk to my politicians and bureaucrats about it. So I'm glad to see that some of the people who were told basically shut up, don't ever tell them that we were here, are not doing that they're actually stepping out and making some noise about this. So are there any cases that you think are going to wind up in front of the Supreme Court or go that far? Because to me, this looks like a slam dunk. I mean, it really does look to me like the moment the police entered, whether it was the home or business, and said, don't tell anybody that we're here, we had a problem, a constitutional problem. So is that heading all the way? I mean, you mentioned one, but I mean, is this going to be settled in the courts pretty soon, do you think?
The Wisconsin Supreme Court is hearing that case. They decided not to have oral arguments, but they're going to decide the case on the briefs, hopefully within the next, I would hope in the next few months, but it's anyone's guess. But meanwhile, a lot of people have spoken out, but we don't know how many other people are living in fear in Wisconsin under these gag orders that they can't even speak out. I agree with you. It's great that people have spoken out. I think it's a fairly slam dunk case. If it isn't, I expect the United States Supreme Court might have something to say about it. But it really is we're already in a very, very bad place with this being allowed to go on, and that's where Pillar of Law Institute comes in. We're going to be combating this, and it's funny, Montana, just yesterday, Governor Scott Bullock signed a law, really comprehensive and destructive campaign finance law that would allow for the same kind of inquisitions, maybe not without the secrecy, but the same kind of persecution of people for engaging in politics, for running for office, whether you're running for office, whether you're just sending out campaign surveys without filling out the right forms. It's all about, they say it's combating corruption, but what it's really doing is shutting people out and threatening to punish people simply for it being part of this great representative democracy.
All right, Steve, thanks for coming on. Where do they find information about what you're working on right now?
Check out pillaroflaw.org.
All right. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.